Today's session will consider the structure and content of Chapter 4 of your dissertation, which reflects on the project management process and the challenges faced in completing the project. Philip Wickham suggests that there are 7 stages that all projects go through. The first 3 stages outlined on this slide have been carried out for you by your tutor, who contacted the clients and actually sat down and worked out with them the kind of issues and challenges that they wanted a group of MA students to carry out research and complete the work and feed back to them later on in the year. In terms of the 4th stage, the kind of formal proposal, this would normally come about having spoken to the client and actually discussed in more detail what the issues were that you were looking to address. And the 5th stage is when you actually start to undertake your project, when you start to not just carry out the research, but also carry out some work into the nature of the project itself, and then begin to take on the kind of data gathering and analysis of your the research. In terms of item 6 or stage 6, this is when you'll written up your project report and delivered that to the client. In terms of follow-up activities, normally this would involve actually taking the finished report to the client, sitting down with the client and actually discussing what the issues were that have arisen from the research that you've carried out. So for all of you, you've got some means by which you can actually look at this project management process from your own perspective and actually reflect back on what happened and where the challenges were in relation to your project. Peter Block provides a slightly different project management framework. Instead of consisting of 7 stages, Block's approach consists of 5 stages. First stage is entry and contract. In other words, this is when the client realises that they have a problem and they'll get in touch with a consultant and begin to actually identify what the issue is that they want the consultant to address. The second stage of this would be, we talked about discovery and dialogue. This is carrying out, it's very similar to kind of preliminary analysis stage in Philip Wickham's model. And this is when begin to develop an understanding about the nature of the problem and begin a dialogue with the client in order to then move on to the 3rd stage and actually provide some feedback on how planning to actually carry out the research. And it's at that point when there's a decision to go forward into the 4th stage, is when you carry out your research. They call this engagement and implementation. For most of our projects, we have the engagement, and the implementation doesn't take place by the MA students. That's done by the client themselves. So this goes some way towards, if we were to reflect back on Philip Wickham's framework, somewhere around to stage 6 in Wickham's model would be stage 4, first part of stage 4 in Peter Block's framework. All of the projects that students undertake for the Creative Industries research project will involve the students addressing a problem that's been identified by the client. However, as Philip Wickham identifies, a problem can have 3 kind of what he refers to as facets. He calls these the rational kind of facet or aspect, a cognitive aspect, and a political aspect. So if we look at these different facets or aspects, a kind of rational aspect relates to the kind of logical view of the problem, which can relate to the cost or economic value linked to the problem. An example of this would be a project carried out this year for Ruskin Museum, and they're interested in developing a retail shop. And so this retail shop really was designed to provide them with an increased source of revenue. So if we were to look at that project, you could see that the rational aspect of that project was linked to the kind of economic value or the revenue that would bring to them. In relation to the cognitive aspect, this is how individuals view the problems, and different individuals in an organisation may view that problem or particular problem situation differently, and that may be due to where they're actually based within the organisation themselves. So, for example, this year we were asked by Lancaster Arts to carry out some research into the perceptions of the artists and get some feedback from artists who worked with the Lancaster Arts and get feedback on how they viewed the technical support that they were given, the kind of producer type of support given by the creative producer, and also issues around the way in which they were actually dealt with by the Lancaster Arts, and compare that to what the kind of support they got from other organisations. So each artist would actually view this in different ways, probably because of the nature of the art form that they were involved in. So it was interesting from this. It would have been interesting if we'd been able to complete this study to get some feedback from the artists on the way in which they actually viewed what Lancaster Arts would seem to think of as being the same set of resources that they made available to those artists. The third facet or aspect is kind of political aspect, the kind of different ways in which the problem is viewed from a political perspective, and the fact that the problem may affect people in different ways. So an example of kind of a political aspect of a problem that we actually dealt with this year, or tried to deal with, was the Dukes and their 18 to 25-year-old membership scheme, and we were looking to get some feedback on this from members of the scheme. In many ways, we can see this as political because it was the Duke's attempt to actually broaden its audience and reach out to a younger age group, because the Duke's kind of audience profile is that 75% of the Duke's audience are 55 and over, and over 2/3 of them are women. And this was a way in which the Dukes were seeking to actually broaden their audience base and actually link very much to the strategic priorities of the Arts Council of England, who provide the Dukes with the majority of their funding. So from a kind of political point of view, you look at it in terms of the Dukes looking to actually help to actually develop an understanding of a new market segment, so that they could report back to the Arts Council of England that they were making strides in moving towards the priorities shown in their strategic their strategy of developing great art for everyone. Most projects will have a range of factors that impact on the success of any project, and we can refer to these as assisters or inhibitors. Assisters, obviously, the factors which help the organisation achieve its goals, and these could be external or internal factors. And there are also inhibitors, those things which limit an organisation achieving its goals. Again, these can be external or internal factors. If we apply this to the projects that you were carrying out, then clearly one of the inhibitors this year for most projects was COVID-19 and the impact that had on your ability to actually carry out the research because of the nature of the coronavirus. In other projects this year, there was some of the inhibitors were down to the lack of resources within the organisation itself. So, for example, it may be that you had difficulty in actually accessing, well, groups did have difficulty in accessing certain individuals who they're actually working with on projects. So some of those inhibitors could be internal factors within the organisation or external factors, such as you mentioned, COVID-19. And again, in terms of assisters, the kind of factors that may help you within organisation is those of you who worked on Ruskin had quite a lot of access to the individuals in the Ruskin Museum, so you could actually talk to them about the nature of the project that you were trying to, of the issue you're trying to resolve. And some of the kind of external factors which may help you may have something to do with the level of information that you're able to actually access about a particular organisation that you're working with. So, you can look at some of these kind of factors that impact on has it impacted on the success of your project, and look at them from two dimensions: those factors that assisted you and helped you with your project, and secondly, those factors that inhibited you in terms of achieving your goals that you set yourself in relation to the project itself. The level of engagement or interaction that you have with a consultant, with a client, will vary depending on the type of client and type of project that you're working on. We can look at it looking at kind of from low to high level of engagement, where a low level of engagement could be that you're given the brief right at the start of the project, and you complete that project without any further reference to the client until the end of the project. This is extremely unusual because you're normally contacting the client to be able to access individuals or groups who you want to carry out research with for the client. So it's unlikely that you'll be at that kind of extreme low end of consultant-client kind of interaction or engagement. As you move along the continuum, the kind of typical way in which we work on these projects is that the consultant is briefed and develops a kind of outline project brief and discusses progress with the client throughout that process, so that as things occur, if there are any challenges that occur, then you're in a position to be able to adapt to meet those changes and actually be able to liaise with the client about what they want you to do in relation to that. None of our projects recently have actually moved towards the top end of that high level of engagement with the client, where you're working more or less as a member of the organisation for a specific time in order to fulfil a task. We have had projects like that in the past, but recently those type of projects have not been there. So this may be a way of you reflecting on the level of engagement that you had with the client, and when you're doing that, carrying out that reflection, do refer to specific situations or examples to illustrate how that engagement and interaction took place over the course of the project itself. With some projects that we've been involved in over the past few years, we have had some shocks. First of these is project shocks that take place during the process of carrying out the research for the client, and that may be because of changes to the client's interest due to unexpected resources. So there might be, due to unexpected opportunities. So they actually want to move into an area where they can perhaps take advantage of an opportunity. Or it may be that there's been cuts in resources and cuts in money available for a project can have obvious consequences. Similar to this, last year when we were working with the Dukes had a kind of financial crisis last year, and one of the projects that the students were working on was one of the methods of data collection was actually having surveyed the audiences of the Dukes. What they wanted to do was have a couple of focus groups, and the Dukes had agreed to help them set those focus groups up. But because of the financial circumstances they found themselves in, the Dukes wanted to carry out focus groups, which were intended to help them develop an understanding about how they could actually get over some of the financial problems that they had. And so that did have an impact on the project last year with the Dukes. because the students weren't able to carry out all of the research that they planned to do. Having said that, in terms of how to deal with those kind of project shocks, we can actually move on to that in the next slide. The example I gave in the previous slide was to do with the Dukes facing a financial crisis and limiting the students from carrying out focus group interviews with the audience members. Although there have been other project shocks, and certainly this year with the Dukes, our major contact point within the Dukes left around February, when students were beginning to carry out their research with the Dukes. So in terms of being able to contact people at the Dukes, one of the problems they had was that our main source of contact wasn't there, and the person who was taking over from that individual didn't have the time to actually spend with the students in order for them to actually progress certain aspects of the project. Some other aspects of the project shocks may be some kind of misinterpretation of information. It may be as well one of the kind of things that I think we had to avoid this year with Ruskin, was that having agreed an initial kind of brief, when we went to talk to the client, they began to talk about adding to those activities and tasks that they wanted to carry out. So we had to actually manage that by going back to them and saying, we need to actually look at this from the original viewpoint, because we don't have the resources to carry out all of the research you're now asking us to do. So we need to try and understand what the limitations are and that we're working with in relation to these kind of shocks that may have an impact on the project itself. How we respond to these shocks are critical in order to be able to continue with the project. And the first thing we would normally do is refer back to what the original aims and objectives were, to see whether they need to be renegotiated, or can the overall aim of the project be achieved with less tasks being completed. So clearly, with when Ruskin wanted to add tasks to the project brief, what we were able to do is go back to them and discuss with them and explain to them that we didn't have the resources to be able to carry all of those new activities out. So the key thing is to look at what the original aims are and to modify the plans if the original aims and objectives were affected. Clearly, with the issue that we talked about in the previous slide with the Dukes project, where we were unable to carry out the focus group, we still had a significant number of questionnaires completed or survey completed. So we were able to actually report back and analyse the issues related to from the audiences, but we had to put some limitations on the findings, and that it didn't have any real in-depth qualitative data which we could report back on. When responding to these project shocks, key issue here is maintaining communication with the organisation and try to identify who needs to be involved with any discussions in order to deal with things in a kind of timely way. And if you've had to go through this, reflect back on the kind of courses of action that you perhaps considered and who you asked for feedback from it. And that could be me, could be one of the other tutors on the programme. But this kind of response and maintaining kind of communication links with the client is critical in terms of how you manage these kind of expectations. Finally, what you really want to do in relation to this chapter, towards the end of this chapter, is to consider in terms of, if you're able to carry out the research, what did your findings show? Did you meet the objectives you set in your project brief? and what were the kind of key findings that will be of interest to the organisation. If you've been able to share those findings with the organisation, and this has been difficult this year because of COVID-19, then what have they asked? What have they said about it? Have they indicated that there's got any follow-up plans for future projects based on your findings? Were they pleased with the findings that you came up with? And if you were to do things again, how might you change things? Just to summarise then what this session has been about, this chapter really needs to consider the project management process and the kind of different challenges that you faced in actually delivering part, if not all, of the project. If you're unable to deliver any of the project, then really look at how you can discuss this. I've given guidance on this within the module guide. The models and concepts that I've identified in this session today give you a guidance or indication of the types of models and concepts. There are other models of the project management process other than Wickham's and other than blocks. There are others, and I'll give you references to these in the next slide. And where there were changes to your project, reflect back and discuss what you needed to do, how did you handle it, and was there any kind of issues that were difficult to resolve. And finally, think about how successful you were in terms of delivering your project aims and objectives as identified in your project brief. I provided you here with 4 references, some of which are available electronically within the library. There are other texts other than these 4 that are available, and I would suggest that you actually look on OneSearch and to identify what electronic resources other than these are available. There are a number of other resources similar to these within the library that you're able to actually get hold of.